Welcome back to Real Estate 101. I'm your host, Joe Terceira, and today we're going to continue our discussion on real estate law, and I'm pleased to be joined once again by Mark Weisleder of Real Property Transactions. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here again.
So Mark, I want to talk a little bit today about the home closing process when you buy a home. So at what point do you need a real estate lawyer after an agreement of purchase and sale has been accepted?
Well, sometimes you need a lawyer during the negotiation process. Many times an agreement might be made conditional upon lawyer review. So then I have to get involved even before the agreement is finally accepted. Sometimes when there's a tenant issue where we're not sure about how long it's going to take to evict a tenant, sometime a real estate agent might be acting on both sides of the deal for the buyer and the seller. And so they want the buyer and the seller to speak to a lawyer first just to make sure that each is very comfortable with the deal. But once the deal is firm, then it's very important that the lawyer get involved very early in the process, whether we're acting for the buyer or the seller.
Right, and I guess in condominium aspects, you would step in and take a look at the status certificate in some cases.
Well, every resale condominium has to be conditional on a review of the status certificate, because this is the full disclosure as to the financial situation, the rules, restrictions, and everything else going on in a condominium. And so typically we don't have a lot of time, but we have a system so that once we're contacted within 2-3 days, we've reviewed it, gone over it with the client so they know exactly whether they're comfortable in going into that building.
Moving forward, right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about title search. Who performs the title search? Is it the seller's lawyer or the buyer's lawyer?
Well, let me make it simple. The main role of a buyer lawyer is to look for problems on the property. The main role for the seller lawyer is solve the problems and prepare the rest of the closing papers. So one of the main things that the buyer lawyer is doing is checking the title. These are the government records that shows what might be registered against title to the property. When a buyer signs an offer, traditionally, they agree to accept what we would call those minor utility easements, the rights that give the phone company, the cable, hydro, the workers to come onto your property to fix the wires. That's what people accept when they buy homes. But there might be all kinds of other things registered against their title, and that's what we have to look for. Is there anything registered that might inhibit or prohibit them, prevent them from doing what they might want to do in the future?
Okay. So what are liens? Why don't you explain a little bit about what are liens and encumbrances on a property?
Well, this is a catch-all phrase for what we might call any kind of problems. So as an example, it could be a major easement. I've seen cases where there's 20-foot easements on a property in favor of the city. This means you're not going to be able to build an extension. You may not be able to build a swimming pool on your property. So this is something you need to know before you buy. And there's no sign in the backyard that says easement below. This is why you have to do searches. There may be a lien registered, like a construction lien. Let's say the owner had work done on the house and never paid for it. Somebody put a lien on title. Well, that's got to be dealt with before closing. There could be mortgages against title. Those things have to be discharged. Let's say somebody sued you and you never paid. They could have a judgment against you. It's going to show up. So these are the things we're looking for. Anything that might impact the buyer from getting a clean title on closing.
Right, and again, because this is a search, this is something the buyer's lawyer would perform in most cases.
That's correct. The buyer's lawyer does this, and if we find any problems, we're sending it off to the seller's lawyer to deal with.
Right. So let's say you do a search for a buyer client and you find a lien on the property. Can that be harmful to the closing process? Like, can you still close that deal, or is that deal a no close until that lien is dealt with?
It depends on the lien. You know, we've had situations where if we know how much money's involved, let's say somebody's claiming $5,000, so we know that that's the total claim. If we can't remove the lien by closing, at least we'll hold that much money aside, close the deal, have enough money set aside so we can pay the lien and get it done after closing. So we'll do whatever is necessary to get the deal done, but in most cases, because it's computerized, we're able to find out about these liens very quickly and then deal with them before closing.
All right. So what is title insurance, and how does that work exactly?
Title insurance is a wonderful insurance sort of like vehicle which allows a buyer to purchase complete title protection in a number of circumstances. So for example, there have been situations where people have been able to break in to the government title records and steal titles. Title insurance completely protects you from any kind of fraud. You'll be put back into your position without any costs at all. Sometimes people don't have a survey when they buy a home, and you're allowed to buy a home without a survey. Well, let's say your house is actually, or your garage is over the property line on your neighbor's property. Your neighbor has the right to tell you to take it down. With title insurance, they will fix this. They will either buy the land from your neighbor or figure out another way to solve the problem. So this is a very wonderful way to solve many of the problems associated with title, with just one insurance premium that you pay when you buy the home. It's based on the sale price of your house.
One-time cost?
One-time cost, you don't have to pay it again, and you're protected throughout your home ownership. So it's a great vehicle, and it provides wonderful protection for buyers.
All right, now does title insurance eliminate the need for a land survey?
It's always great to have a land survey. You know, it's like any insurance policy. It doesn't cover absolutely everything. Let's say you're promised 40 feet frontage. You don't have a survey. You don't know if you got 40 feet.
That's right.
You find out after closing you got 39. Will title insurance compensate you for that lost foot? The answer is usually no, because title insurance says you got the land you were looking at. It's between the fences. That's how you based your price on. We're not going to compensate you because you didn't lose any money. This is why it's always great to have a survey, so then you can confirm whether the entire boundaries are exactly as you've been told in the offer. So it's always great to have a survey, but title insurance does protect you against most problems that you would otherwise find on a survey.
All right. So Mark, let's say a buyer buys a home and the deal's firmed up, and a week before or a few days before they decide, you know, they don't want the home anymore, or they can't close the deal for whatever reason. What happens?
It's a very serious situation, Joe, because, you know, the seller's counting on that money, usually because they're buying another property themselves. Now, there could be lots of reasons. The buyer may not have their financing in order. Maybe the bank didn't decide to go through with the deal because they misled them on their income or something like that. Right. Or they just had a case of buyer's remorse. They got terrified. They didn't want to go through with the deal. So this is what's going to happen. Number one, they will lose their deposits. Whatever deposit they paid, they will forfeit. Now, let's say the price for the home was $400,000, and then they back out last minute, and now the seller turns out and has to resell it again, and he only gets $360,000, so he loses $40,000. The buyer has to pay that full $40,000 loss, plus the extra interest, plus lawyers and everything else. So it's a serious damage problem that the buyer is going to have. And one of the things, you know, I love about my practice and the services we offer through Real Property is if you're a seller, for a very small premium, you can actually buy $25,000 of protection in case a buyer chooses not to close for any reason. So if you have to carry two houses while you're selling, you're covered for up to $25,000 in costs while this is going on. So it's a wonderful way for sellers to protect themselves at a very minimal cost against this happening. But buyers should know that it's a real problem when they can't close, and they could be on the hook for thousands of dollars.
Right. Okay, so you know, one thing I want to talk about is something that most people don't really understand, buyers and sellers in real estate, and that is that when you buy or sell a home, the deed to that home is transferred. That's the physical, tangible deed of, you know, going from seller to buyer. Who prepares that deed and who transfers that deed?
It's very interesting now because as a result of the magic of the government, we're actually able to transfer properties on the computer. So the seller's lawyer will prepare the physical deed, and this will be signed by the buyer, which transfers title to the buyer. It'll be signed by the seller, which will transfer title to the buyer. But really what the seller is saying to his lawyer is he gives the authority to the lawyer to press the buttons on the computer in order to start the transfer process. Right. And then the buyer, when they walk into the buyer lawyer office, they're basically saying to the buyer lawyer, you have the authority to complete the transfer. So what happens on the day of closing is, let's say I'm acting for the buyer. we will take the money that's due on closing, and we'll, in most cases, wire it right into the trust account of the seller lawyer. So they have the money, they confirm they have the money, then they will call our office and say, we're ready to do the transfer. And at that time, they release the deed so that we can register. We will do a final sub-search just to make sure that nobody tried to put something on title from the time we did our first search, which might have been when the deal was signed a month previous. So during that 1 month period, and we've had cases where people have slipped something on title the day before closing, when we've had to scramble to try to lift it. So you're always doing that final search, press the last few buttons, and title changes.
All right.
That's how it's done.
So what about things like utilities, hydro and stuff? Who handles that?
Well, the lawyers will be in touch with the seller and the buyer early in the process. So for the sellers, very important that you get the bank information to the lawyer. We'll need a mortgage statement to find out how much is payable to discharge your mortgage. So that's one of the key things for the seller to do, is get in touch with their bank. How much is owing on your mortgage? We got to pay that off on closing. Right. Then they will notify all the utility companies that they're leaving. And so the utility companies will arrange to read the meters and on closing, and the seller will be responsible for all the bills up to closing. Then the buyer is in touch with the same utility company saying, we're moving in. They've got to set up accounts, and then they will be billed right from the closing date going forward. And the only other thing the seller has to make sure is that they've dealt with the property taxes. So they've paid the property taxes up to date, so those final adjustments can be made, because like everything, the seller's responsible for all the costs up to closing, and then the buyer is responsible for everything.
All right. So for today's final question, how can a buyer avoid any last-minute problems at closing?
One of the big problems, there's a lot of different areas. One of the things that I find is if you're buying and selling on the same day, it could be a nightmare if your buyer can't close or is late closing, and then you don't have the money to pay for your own purchase.
Right, I've seen deals that got held up like 14 couples long.
It's a terrible thing. And so my advice in all those situations is to get bridge financing. When you get bridge financing, what you're saying to the bank on your purchase is, give me a little extra money to close my entire deal. And then when I close my sale, I'll pay you the money back. Right. And as a lawyer, all we have to do is sign a letter saying that when we get the money from the sale, we'll send it to the bank. And this way the bank gives us all the money early in the morning. We close the purchase. And then if the sale gets delayed a little bit, it doesn't matter. It's just costing the borrower interest for 1 day. For 1 day. So that solves all of those kinds of issues. Just think about bridge financing. That's number one. Number two, when you're applying for your mortgage, very important that you take the proper picture ID to your lender and make sure all the paperwork, because I've seen situations where we look at somebody's passport and it's not the same name as what's they've given to the mortgage company, and now you have to put title in your proper English name. And then,
there's a variance somewhere.
Oh, and then you're looking at all these documents that you've already prepared for the mortgage company. The names are all wrong. You've got to get permission to make changes. Very important. I know it's a small thing, but when they apply for their mortgage, they take their proper ID, picture ID, health cards, for example, not allowed. You have to have a driver's license or passport, and then maybe they'll accept some other things, a residence card or something, but you really have to have the proper documents to make sure the name is correct on your mortgage application, and then whatever else the mortgage company needs, you've got to make sure you get arranged. The house insurance, very important. Insurance companies, they look at every line. Sometimes if you don't put the name of the insurance, of the mortgage company and their address on the insurance policy, they don't accept it. Right. And these things we find out at 3 o'clock on the day of closing, that the bank's not satisfied with the insurance, and the client's running around to their insurance agent, and it's like a panic. These are the things that they have to do in advance. That's one of the things we do. We send them a letter telling them we need all of this done early in the process so that everything will happen on closing quicker. So those are some of the problems I see on a daily basis.
All right, Mark, good stuff. Thanks very much for coming on today's show.
Thank you, Joe. It's always great being here.
And we'll see you again next month.
Thank you.
If anybody has any more questions or would like more information on closing the purchase of their home, they can get in contact with Real Property Transactions. I'm your host, Joe Terceira. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.